In a previous lecture, we discussed the use of standards to help management make decisions. We saw how we came up with a standard amount for the cost to manufacture a case of potato chips. We came up with $12 per case. Managers are able to use that to plan. One thing they can do is plan using a budget. In this flexible budget we looked at previously, we saw how the standard amount could be used as part of the budgeting process to come up with the cost of goods sold, $12 a case. However, as we run through the period, as we went through the month, we also found that what really happened, does not necessarily match up with what we expected to happen on our standard costs. We call those variances. And we need to track down the cause of these variances, whether they're good variances, meaning they're favorable, or they're not so good variances, meaning they're unfavorable. So using the standards that we set up for direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, we're going to look at how we can find variances for each of these. We'll start by looking at the direct materials. We see here our standards are 5 pounds per case, and we expect the potatoes to cost us $1.50 per pound. Let's look at what really happened and how that's different from what was expected. To calculate a total direct material variance, we take the actual situation, what we actually did, how many pounds of potatoes did we actually use, and the actual price we paid per pound, and then compare it to the standards that we looked at earlier. So we're going to use those standards on the right side of this equation, standard quantity and standard price. So we look at our records at the end of the month, and we see that we used 160,000 pounds of potatoes. That's what we really ended up using, and the amount that we paid for the potatoes were $1.40 per pound. Let's compare that to the standard. Now the standard quantity is a little tricky. We want to know how many pounds of potatoes we should have used to make the potato chips that we actually made. So that means we need to do a little side calculation here. We're going to calculate the standard quantity to use in the above formula. So what you do is you say, well, how many cases of potato chips did we really make? The actual number of finished goods. How many cases we really did make. In this situation, we made 31,000 cases of potato chips. That's really what we generated in our factory. Now remember the standard amount of potato chips. We said we should use 5 pounds per case. That's what we expect the employees, the workers, to use when they're making a case of potato chips. So if they made 31,000 cases and they were expected to use 5 pounds per case, then the amount that they should have used are 155,000 pounds. So we'll put that in the standard quantity area. Often this is where students miss this problem, is because they don't do the side calculation before they put the number in the standard quantity. Then the standard price was the price that managers expected to pay. We saw that was $1.50 per pound. So when we multiply out the left side, we get 224,000, and the right side is 232,500. That's a variance of $8,500. We need to determine if this is a favorable variance or unfavorable. And if you look at the left side, that's what really happened. And we see that it is lower than the right side, which is what we expected to happen. If your costs are lower than you expected, that's favorable. So we'll say this variance is favorable. Why is the variance favorable? Well, it's either because we were efficient with the use of potatoes, or we got the potatoes at a really good price, or a combination of the two. So we're going to break this down and look at the material price and material quantity variance. First, looking at the direct material price variance. We're using the same numbers, the same variables from above, just in a different order. We're going to do the actual quantity times the actual price, then the actual quantity times the standard price. When you take that, you can rearrange it mathematically, and you can put the actual quantity together and then subtract the actual price from the actual quantity. This is just the same formula, just rearranged using math. So when we plug the numbers into the formula, we have the 160,000 pounds that was given to us before, and then we have the actual price, $1.40 that we paid, and the standard price. And when we multiply this out, we get $16,000. Now don't put positive or negative, make whatever number you have positive, and then you have to determine whether it's favorable or unfavorable. Rather than using positive and negative to make that determination, think about it like this. If the actual price is higher than the standard price, then that's unfavorable. If you pay more than you expected, that's not good. In this case, the actual price was lower than the standard price. We paid less. When you see that, you can say that is favorable. Our material budget was very favorable, $16,000. Let's next look at the material quantity variance. We want to take the actual quantity times the standard price. Again, this is information that we already used in the total direct material variance. We're just rearranging the variable. So actual quantity times standard price minus standard quantity times standard price. We can rearrange that formula to put, since we have standard price in two areas, we can just put that together mathematically and then multiply that by the actual quantity minus the standard quantity. So we're just taking the formula and rearranging it mathematically. The standard price is $1.50. That was what we had set up earlier. And then we figured out the actual quantity was given to us for the month at 160,000 pounds, the total number of potatoes that we actually used. The standard quantity we figured out earlier at 155,000 pounds. That's how many potatoes we should have used to make the 31,000 cases of potato chips. We ended up with $7,500. Again, instead of looking at this as a positive or negative number, forget about positive and negative and think about it as favorable or unfavorable. We see the actual quantity is higher than the standard quantity. When you see that you actually used more than you should have, we see that's unfavorable. So using more than you expected is not a good thing. What happens with these variances now is that we need to give a reason for these. This is what managers do. This is where they come into play for the reason that they're doing these variances in the first place. So for the direct material price variance, you have to ask yourself, who would you talk to? And typically you would talk to purchasing or supply chain. And you would ask the person who purchased these, what happened? Why was my price variance so good? Some reasons for the price being different from what they expected could be something like they got a new vendor. They shopped around for a new vendor, or a new vendor started selling potatoes and that vendor had a better price. Maybe they decided to buy in bigger bulk, or there were some kind of economic influences, such as the economy had a deflation instead of an inflation, or there was a bumper crop of potatoes that caused the supply to be much higher than they expected. And then I put etc. because every business is different, every situation is different. So what you're looking for is the reason why the price was different, whether it was favorable or unfavorable. Looking at material quantity variance, that has to do with efficiency. That has to do with being efficient with the use of our material. So who do you speak to? Well, you have to go to operations and see what the employees are doing in the factory. Some reasons that they might find for the efficiency being, in this case, worse, could be the quality of material. I mean, if the potatoes are rotten, then they have to throw a lot out. Or if the bags are all torn, the potatoes come in and they're falling all over the place. Training of the employees, that can have a big impact as to how efficient the employees are. The working conditions. Are the employees comfortable and able to concentrate? What about supervision? Proper supervision makes sure that the employees are concentrating on the job and not doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or taking too many or too long of breaks. And then the machinery maintenance. If the machinery is in good maintenance, then it's not going to cause them problems. If the machinery is poorly maintained, it could lead to more potatoes getting destroyed and having to start over with new potatoes. So these are some of the reasons that managers typically find for variances for price and quantity for the materials. Next, we'll look at the direct labor variance. The labor variance is going to help us to see in HR and in operations where we have an expected need for improvements, or where we've made improvements that are working for us. What we're going to do is we're going to get the actual hours and actual rate of pay from the payroll and human resources, and we're going to then compare that to what we expected them to use, the employees to use in the hours, and what we expected to pay the employees. We'll start with the actual hours and the actual rate. Again, this is stuff that would be given to us. We would have to get it from either human resources or payroll, and we see how many actual hours were worked to make the potato chips, and how much we actually paid. Then we're going to compare this to the standards. Now the standard hours, again, is something that we need to do a side calculation for. This is the standard number of hours, or the expected amount of hours we would need to make the cases of potato chips that we completed. So we'll start with the actual number of finished cases of potato chips, and we got that number earlier as 31,000 cases. This is the potato chips that we completed. Earlier we determined that the standard amount of hours to manufacture a case of potato chips is 0.05. So 0.05 hours is how much time our employees need to manufacture a case. Then we would expect the employees to spend 1,550 hours. We'll multiply that by the standard rate, which we came up with earlier at $22 per hour as our standard rate for employees. So when we multiply this out, we get our actual side at $34,875 and our standard or expected side to be $34,100. So the variance is $775. Let's not think about positive or negative, but favorable or unfavorable. If the actual side is higher than the expected standard, and it is, then that's unfavorable. In our case, $775 unfavorable. However, if the actual amount is lower than the standard, then that would be favorable. Again, think about it like a cost. If the cost comes in to be actually lower than what you expected, that would be favorable. If it comes in to be higher, then that would be unfavorable. We need to break this down and look at the quantity of hours and the price that we paid for the labor to determine what's causing this unfavorable variance. Looking at the rate variance, we're going to take the actual hours times the actual rate, we got that earlier, and then we're going to compare that to the actual hours times the standard rate. We're going to take this formula and just rearrange it mathematically to get actual hours times actual rate minus standard rate. We see we get a difference of 1,875. Again, don't look at this as a positive or negative number. Just whatever number you get, put as a positive. And then we need to determine if it's favorable or unfavorable. Since the actual rate is higher than the standard rate, we see this as unfavorable, meaning we paid employees more than we expected, so that leads to an unfavorable variance. Labor efficiency variance lets us know how efficient our workers are at doing their job. Actual hours times standard rate minus standard hours times standard rate. You can use that formula, or you can change it mathematically to see standard rate times actual hours minus standard hours. The standard rate we have is $22 per hour. The actual number of hours we found earlier were 1,500 hours, and the standard hours we determined from our side calculation as 1,550. When we do the math, we get a difference of 1,100. Again, don't think of it as positive or negative. We need to think as favorable or unfavorable. Because the actual hours are lower than the standard hours, what we can say is that this is a favorable variance. Our workers worked less hours than were expected. That's a good thing. That's favorable. So what we need to do is figure out the story behind these variances. That's really the benefit management gets from the variances. Knowing the numbers doesn't help them at all. They need to find out why. Who would we go to discuss the variance for the labor rate? Well, probably HR or payroll. And then we would ask or try to figure out what caused this difference between what was actually paid and what was expected. It could have been, for example, negotiations by the union or negotiations by the employees to get a pay raise, bonuses that came in different from what was expected, or what if benefits changed, so maybe health insurance changed and they weren't expecting it. In this case, let's say, for example, that some employees became sick on the line, and so the supervisors stepped in to take over for those employees. Well, the supervisors, maybe they make more per hour, and so that caused a difference, a variance between what was expected to be paid and what was actually paid to manufacture those potato chips. The labor efficiency variance helps us to understand what was going on as far as efficiency for the employees. In this case, we have a favorable efficiency variance. We would want to understand why our efficiency variance was favorable so we could maybe replicate it later. Some of the reasons are similar to the direct material quantity variance. Do we have good quality of materials? Because poor materials, for example, potatoes that are that are rotten means that we're going to take longer as employees to set up the machines. Working conditions can cause employees to be tired and work slower. Supervision, workers that are being supervised are going to work more efficiently. Machinery maintenance, again, machinery that's been maintained well is going to work properly and make their employees more efficient. In this case, we had some better skilled workers stepping in for sick leave. Remember, the supervisors stepped in to take over for the regular workers that were sick. Well, perhaps these supervisors are supervisors because they're very good at the job. And so because they're better, they're more efficient. And so now that the managers know what was going on, they can make decisions to either try to fix or reduce unfavorable variances and try to get favorable variances to happen again in the future. The use of variances can be a very useful tool for managers.